So the journalist Aaron McCabe just released a new document, and what it was the May 16, 2017 electronic communication that was sent by the FBI that was used to open a new investigation focused solely on President Trump, right after he'd assumed the presidency. And this document, which by the way was completely redacted, predictably so, it differed from the Crossfire Hurricane investigation that was opened back in July 31st, 2016, more than what, 8 months earlier, focused on the Trump campaign and less on Trump himself, other members of the campaign. The idea was to cast, kind of a net that surrounded Trump. But this new investigation was done in the aftermath of Comey's firing, immediately in the aftermath, and focused directly on President Trump himself. We'll probably see that it was an espionage investigation. But what this really did is this brought us back to a figure that we've always felt has not gotten enough attention, and that is Andrew McCabe, the now acting FBI director. And this date of May 16th is very important because it's surrounded by a number of events. Obviously, the firing of James Comey on May 9th, but also the FBI's efforts to suddenly re-engage with senior DOJ official Bruce Orr, who's married to Nellie Orr, who was working for Fusion GPS. And of course, the instigation of the Mueller investigation. So it's a very compressed period of time. But it leads us into the activities of McCabe, who's, anywhere you look with Andrew McCabe, you just find more dirt. So we thought it would be a good opportunity to sort of do two things. Explore this event in this time period, and also explore kind of the larger activities of McCabe.
Yeah, I mean, to begin with, I'd say, of course, hindsight is always 20/20 and so on. But when Comey was fired, McCabe should have been fired at the same time.
Yeah.
Because one was going to do the dirty work of the other, whoever got fired first, kind of thing. And unfortunately, that's how it worked out. Maybe let's just start off here with this new document that you mentioned that came out and what it says. I mean, there's a sentence in there that is just so unbelievably bad in terms of, well, just read it. Let's read it out here, and then everyone will see that it just demands consequences of some kind. We got a couple of weeks here to go until Trump comes in, and let's just put it up here and everyone will see what I mean. So the FBI opened, and then it's redacted, but either that's the name of the investigation or something like an enterprise investigation or a full investigation. Let's just go with that. So the FBI opened a full investigation based on an articulable factual basis that reasonably indicated that President Donald J. Trump may be or had been wittingly or unwittingly involved in activities for or on behalf of the government of the Russian Federation. Mind-blowing, isn't it?
Yep, it really is. The audacity of that, especially viewed with what we know with hindsight, right? Everything that we know now. Those words, would resonate very strongly. Again, it's always worth reminding people what the environment was like. And that first half of 2017 was so toxic that Trump was, there was a lot of bets that he wasn't going to make it. His presidency wasn't going to make it, and that he might even not make all of 2017. I mean, it looked pretty dark at that point in time, and all of the deep state's weapons were really coming to bear. But now, with the hindsight and knowing what we know after all these years, it's insanity. And it shows how McCabe was operating. Honestly, I feel like McCabe was operating more out of bounds than Comey was. You mentioned that when Comey was fired, McCabe should have been fired 100%. But McCabe was even doing some things that I'm not sure that Comey was even fully apprised of. He was kind of leading the charge, that little net of Strozak and more importantly, Lisa Page, who was McCabe's special counsel. Not to be confused with the designation of special counsel as it applies to Mueller. In this case, it meant that that Page was his personal attorney. But McCabe was involved in pretty much everything, and he was brought up very quickly by Comey and into things.
I think the distinction is that Comey is the ultimate kind of weasel where he does things for his own good. Comey does what's good for Comey. If Trump had not been a threat to him personally, he'd have just let it be. He'd have just been FBI director for another 4 years. Whereas McCabe is much more of an operative, like a Democrat operative, and just the worst kind, a political operative. And we can get into some of the details as to his connections to Clinton. So, for instance, with Comey, I don't think those connections are as clear. And even if they were, Comey thinks of himself most of all. He's the ultimate narcissist. Everything's
Right.
about him. Whereas McCabe, I agree with you, is almost more dangerous in that way because he was a tool for these political forces. He was being used, and he was a full believer in those causes. And well, I mean, you dug up some, not recently, I mean, long time ago, you wrote about this, some of McCabe's connections to the Democrat machine.
He was, McCabe, first of all, McCabe's ascendancy was very quick. One of the things that we'd both taken a look at past times was the moves that Comey made in reshaping the FBI. And the number of moves at the senior level, people at the FBI always move around. That's part and parcel of being in the FBI. But the number of senior positions that were altered by Comey in sort of the period of, we'll call it late 2015 into the first part of 2017, and particularly late 2016, early 17, it was really startling how many pieces were moved about. McCabe was one of the people that was elevated very, very quickly and got pulled up and put into sort of the third pole position in the FBI, and then was almost immediately assigned to becoming number 2 as the the assistant director of the FBI. And McCabe, maybe it's worth just talking about the Clinton part because that's very telling as to how McCabe kind of came into being. And the Clinton investigation had gotten started. The FBI was running it. And the New York Times had just outed, I'm looking for my dates here, but had just sort of outed that there was an investigation into the Clinton Foundation, or excuse me, into the Clinton emails. And that had just become public. I think it was back in March, I want to say March 15th, something like that, 2015. And right at that very point in time, he and his wife Jill were suddenly approached by Terry McAuliffe, longtime Clinton confidant, Democrat operative, power player, and came to Jill McCabe and said, "Hey, I hear you're interested in making a run for office. And, I think that's a wonderful idea. You should do that. And guess what? I'm going to provide you with a bunch of funding. Here's a huge amount of, it was almost $500,000 in campaign contributions, which, by the way, amounted to about a third of her total campaign contributions. It just vaulted her into a position where suddenly she actually may have had a chance. She ultimately lost, but she had a chance. Even got a Washington Post endorsement of Jill McCabe. Like, who the hell is Jill McCabe, at that point in time? So it really elevated this campaign of hers and made her viable and put a lot of support behind her. Well, why was that? Because Andrew McCabe his office was in charge of providing, he wasn't yet directly overseeing the Clinton email investigation, but his office was tangentially in charge, where he was providing direct oversight and support. He later took the entire investigation on personally. So he was in a position to shepherd that investigation, which indeed he did. And he ended up taking over the entire investigation, and he refused to give that position up, even though his conflicts of interest, which were obvious to people who knew, were being called out. He kept it all the way until a week before the election, absolutely refused to let it go and controlled it. Even went so far as to issue, I forget the exact name of it, but it's basically where we're going to give you the headquarters treatment to the investigation, which in FBI parlance means we're going to give you a pass, that we're not going to do anything. And effectively, that's what happened. It was a big, giant whitewash. So McCabe took personal control of the Clinton email investigation on February 1st, 2016, but he'd been involved long before that when McAuliffe approached him. And again, refused to back out and recuse himself from the investigation right up until the actual election happened.
Right, and they, of course, they couldn't have cared less. I mean, the Democrats, Democrat operatives, people like McAuliffe, people like Clinton herself, and so on, they couldn't have cared less if Jill McCabe won that seat or not. That was
No,
completely
no.
irrelevant. All that mattered was to basically buy Andrew McCabe's loyalty for that period of time during which the election was taking place. That means Hillary Clinton's election, and to make sure this email problem gets buried. And that's exactly what happened. The
Yeah.
email problem was buried.
And this wasn't I mean, she was running for a state Senate seat in Virginia, and she had no political experience, had never run for office before. This wasn't it wasn't the kind of thing that Terry McAuliffe would be giving any attention to, and yet he did.
Exactly. Why would he care about some state Senate seat in Virginia to do with someone who has no political experience, nothing whatsoever, other than the fact that she happens to be the wife of the deputy director of the FBI, who happens to be the lead investigator or the overseer of the Clinton email investigation. And then when we talk about lead investigator, that wasn't McCabe. That was Peter Strzok. That's the other thing that often kind of gets overlooked in all this noise and all this. I mean, it's more than noise. It's just so many facts out there. The same guy who led the Trump investigation, this fraudulent Crossfire Hurricane investigation, was also in charge of the Clinton email investigation, Peter Strzok, that corrupt FBI agent. But of course, he ties in directly with McCabe and that whole cabal because his paramour was Lisa Page. And as you mentioned, Lisa Page was Andrew McCabe's personal lawyer. So you got that little triangle going on over there, where they're all knowing what they do and telling each other what they do, and everything's coordinated. So McCabe was the perfect person to kind of buy in this respect by the Clinton people, because, well, not only was he the deputy director of the FBI, but he was directly responsible for the investigation, which they wanted to, well, either shut down or not go anywhere. And that's exactly how it panned out.
Yeah, and that meeting actually was what probably vaulted him to prominence, because he was a high-level FBI official, but he wasn't in the real ring of power. He wasn't even at FBI headquarters at that point. And after that meeting, that's when his real ascendancy began. And it's also it's a little bit of a digression, but worth noting that Terry McAuliffe wasn't an uninterested party. He was under FBI investigation for contributions that he'd taken from a Chinese businessman who, oh, by the way, had also made significant contributions to the Clinton Foundation. So, that's why McAuliffe came in and got involved. Not only was he obviously worried about Hillary Clinton and her candidacy, but he was also worried about himself and, the investigation that was going on into him. And of course, that all came to nothing. I don't think anybody's really ever heard any more. There was initial announcements that was being looked at, and that just all evaporated and went away as well.
Right. And so for that guy to come back to Trump here, for this guy that we just talked about and all his connections with the Democrats and how he was basically corrupted by Democrats, directly corrupted, blackmailed for want of a better word, in terms of, you got to do this and so we help your wife. This guy was then in charge of the entire FBI at the moment that Comey was fired. And he immediately seized upon that. And by the way, that was planned. This wasn't like happenstance, like, oh, Comey was fired. Oh, what are we going to do now? They had prepared for that moment because they knew that Comey was so completely out of control, so completely rogue in the things he did. For instance, back in March of 2017, Comey went in front of the world and said that the Trump campaign is being investigated for Russia collusion, which was, it was factually true in terms of there was an investigation, but everything else about that was a lie. Plus, at that time, when Comey said it, they already knew there wasn't anything to it, because the Steele dossier primary source, this guy called Igor Danchenko, had confessed to the FBI back in 2 months earlier, in January of 2017, that the whole thing was just lies. So Comey did that. Obviously, it was also totally against all the rules, because you're not supposed to say whether there is investigation or the state is, that the usual kind of stuff. And he usurped those rules. Now, he got approval from Rod Rosenstein to do that, but that's a separate story. So it was obvious that Comey was really, really bad news and doing really bad things. and eventually he was going to get fired. And Lisa Page, Peter Strzok, and Andrew McCabe had cooked up this plan what to do once Comey gets fired. And there's text messages to that effect, that they were now going to execute on that plan. And that, of course, then happened on May 9th when Comey was fired, 2017. And then they opened the investigation, as you said earlier, not into the Trump campaign, but Trump himself, that portion that I read out earlier. And there are so many problems with that. I mean, we discussed the Clinton problem, the fact that you have a Clinton operative running the FBI and a guy who has been corrupted and opening this investigation. I have a huge problem with the three words here. Let's bring it up again. Articulable factual basis. What they're saying is that there are some facts that Trump is a Russian agent. Now, what are those facts? There weren't any. They don't exist. As I said earlier, even if the only one, this is something else that's often overlooked, the only one who's ever alleged Russia collusion in an explicit way, not like, oh, I've seen some evidence or whatever, but actually said it explicitly, Trump is a Russian agent. The only person who's ever said that is Christopher Steele. And yet the FBI had Steele's primary source tell them that the whole thing was a big fat lie. So there is no articulable factual basis. It just simply didn't exist. And
Right.
yet those are the words
just for clarity, what you were talking about, this idea, bearing in mind that this was issued on May 16th, 2017, traces directly back to Igor Danchenko, who had been interviewed by the FBI at the start of the year, and the FBI knew that everything that he told Chris Steele was an absolute lie. So the idea that, 4 months, 5 months later, they could be making this claim, they factually knew that all of that was false. So everything they put down that we at least can see publicly in the electronic communication is utterly false, total fabrication. And they knew it was a total fabrication.
Exactly. And so those are the three words that bother me personally the most, because there is no such factual basis. It's just a total lie. And it's not even, obviously anyone with a functioning brain would have known from day one that the entire Steele dossier was just made up. It's just such a childish piece of work. It's just so ridiculous. But let's assume they're all extremely dumb or whatever, and they don't understand. Well, that excuse would no longer apply, that we're too dumb to understand. The Keystone Cops kind of argument doesn't work anymore after January of 2017, because, as you just said, that's when the primary source told them, no, this is all made up. This is all just gossip and stuff from my friends back home. None of it has any relevancy. So at that point, it was game over. And of course, these guys just kept lying about that. And this is the point where, when you read what we read out here earlier, that they made an allegation saying that there's a factual basis that Donald Trump is a Russian agent, that is just so incredibly bad on every single level that it just demands massive repercussions. Even now, we're 9 years on, 8 years on, whatever. This demands major, major repercussions, and we haven't even talked about the constitutional aspect of that. Constitutionally, Donald Trump at the time as president was the head of the executive, and everything, all powers of the executive flow from the presidency. So there is no constitutional authority of any kind for some guy in the FBI, especially a totally corrupted guy like Andrew McCabe, to start claiming that he knows what is in the interest of the United States and that Donald Trump is working against that interest, and so on and so forth. That just doesn't work. It doesn't work because he doesn't have that authority. He works on delegated authority from Trump. So anyway, I don't want to dwell on this.
No, I think it is worth dwelling on a little bit. I mean, here's the idea that Andrew McCabe takes over the mantle of the FBI, and as a means to both preserve himself and to carry out the task that he was given by these DNC operatives, he went out to knowingly undercut the office of the U.S. presidency, knowing that what was in that electronic communication was utterly false. And I mean, that's demonstrable. Igor Danchenko, that whole sequence proves that was absolutely true. And he tried to destroy a sitting U.S. president based on false information, because both to preserve himself and for, I don't know what you want to call it, political gain, but at political direction. I mean, that smacks of treason to me. You don't usually throw that word around lightly, but I'm not sure
No,
whether the word
you are
applies
correct.
appropriately.
So I think we should delineate here. You're absolutely right. If, as is actually truthfully, factually the case, this was all made up by McCabe and Strzok and so on, there was never a basis. And if they ever thought there was, Igor Danchenko put an end to that.
Shattered that.
So, on the basis that this was all a lie, which they knew to be a lie at the time, 100% beyond any doubt, that is absolutely treasonous, no question about it. The constitutional argument it goes beyond that. The constitutional argument, and that's why I didn't want to get kind of too far into it, but I mean it's worth kind of delineating here, is even if Andrew McCabe was right that there was something, there was some there, or it looked like there was a there, or whatever, he still did not have the authority under the Constitution to decide what is in the national security interest of the United States or not, because that authority is vested with the president. So even in that case, he would have been acting contrary to the Constitution. He was acting outside of the Constitution, what he was doing. But okay, let's not dwell on that, as I said, because that's the case. But we know that it's much worse than that, because he actually lied. And then your word is, I know it gets kind of overused and so on, but that is 100% treasonous. And in a way, it's even worse than what Comey did. Comey always kind of covered himself in some way. Have you noticed that Comey never signed his name under any of these things? So for instance, when he went out in March of 2017 and told the world about this Trump investigation, he just read out talking points written by other people. So Comey, very smart, again, that narcissist, that weasel, where he can always kind of say, well, but he told me and I was relying on this and that and whatever. The thing we just read out, the thing that came out the other day, that is McCabe. There is no, someone else told me to do that. That's him.
Comey was always much more careful, and I also think Comey was very cognizant of the fact that Brennan was trying to, CIA Director John Brennan had been sort of, I don't know if setting him up is exactly right, but kind of pushing things his way. If Brennan was sending everything into the FBI, I think he had Comey's willing assistance, but he was also kind of forcing Comey's hand. And Comey was always smart enough to be sort of careful. And McCabe, I always saw it as Comey was kind of handling the strategic grand strategy for the FBI. And McCabe was the guy on the ground handling the day-to-day operations of things. Now, coming back to this idea, this sort of treasonous element, and the fact that McCabe was now running in sort of panic mode after Comey had been fired, and this statement that you've highlighted, those three words. Now, it's important then to bear in mind what McCabe did next. And this is something that I'd stumbled on a long time ago and have been kind of fascinated with ever since. And that is that suddenly McCabe decided he was going to try to re-engage with Christopher Steele, and actually tasked former DOJ official Bruce Orr to reach out to Steele and try and re-engage with him. And that carries a lot more weight in the light of events when you remember that, again, they knew Christopher Steele had been completely discredited by Danchenko, and the FBI was fully aware of that. So any pretense that this was meant to be some sort of honest, necessary investigation, that's just gone. He's reaching out to Christopher Steele, trying to find anything that he can from a source, the author of the dossier, who he knows factually has been utterly and completely discredited. It was purely a political move. And oh, by the way, a lot of people don't realize, but Christopher Steele, Bruce Orr, and Andrew McCabe all go back a long period of time, back to McCabe's days as head of the FBI's Eurasian division. Andrew McCabe and Bruce Orr had worked together over the years a number of different times, and Steele came into and out of that orbit. So, nor were these even just, these were He's utilizing long-standing relationships to try to pull this off on top of everything else. I mean, it was Bruce Orr who brought the Steele dossier after a personal meeting with Christopher Steele on July 30th. Bruce Orr, his wife Nellie Orr, Christopher Steele, and an unnamed associate of Christopher Steele met for lunch, or I think it was actually breakfast, on July 30th. Bruce Orr gets the Steele dossier. What does he do? He immediately calls up his friend Andrew McCabe at the FBI and brings it to him a day or two later. Never been able to pin that down entirely. I think it was August 2nd or August 3rd, that meeting. But almost immediately brings it in McCabe's office, and there's Lisa Page. And the three of them go through the entirety of the Steele dossier right there on the spot. That's how McCabe got it.
Yeah, and they always lie about that. They always say, "Oh, FBI didn't know about this until much later." Blah blah blah.
Right.
That's absolute crap. I'm obviously, we talked about this before. They initially got it on July 5th of 2016, but they've sort of covered their tracks in terms of how and how far it was distributed at that time. So, well, maybe someone in the FBI got it, but I didn't see it. That sort of that whole game. But obviously, even if you believe that, which you shouldn't, he got it from, as you say, from Orr, and that's the end of it at that point. So by kind of August 2nd, he had it. And about hiring Steele, I mean, there's a couple of huge problems there. Again, logical and truthfulness and so on and so forth. Let's just assume that Steele is not a liar who made everything up, which they knew. Let's just assume they didn't know that. Or that Steele wasn't a liar. Well, they'd interviewed Steele tons of times. He was their own source. They were paying him money as a source. He was feeding them the dossier. They were in constant touch with him and so on. They knew everything they wanted to know. So why would they then have to contact him right as they're opening this investigation into Trump? Shouldn't they already have all the facts? I mean, the fact that it says there's a factual basis, that's Steele. Well, you have your facts. Why do you need to talk to the guy? I'm just kind of playing devil's advocate here. So obviously, there was another purpose for talking to the guy. Plus, everything had been discredited anyway. And as you say, it was entirely political. They needed to make sure, and McCabe especially, that once this investigation to Trump was opened, that Steele was fully on board, that he knew what was going on, and that he wouldn't sort of inadvertently...
He was going to play ball.
...discover it in some way. Exactly. Exactly right. So, for instance, McCabe knew as this investigation would lead to a special counsel, which was his intention. That's why he did it, because Trump's FBI cannot investigate Trump himself. Hence, it was like this sort of checkmate move where as soon as McCabe does that, he knows there's going to be special counsel. Well, eventually, special counsel is going to talk to Christopher Steele. So, of course, you need to make sure that Steele is going to play ball, knows what the... It's not that Steele was suddenly going to be a Trump fan or bail out Trump. That's never going to happen. But they needed to get their stories aligned.
They needed to know what Steele would say if he was questioned by an alternate source.
Exactly.
And just so people understand what was going on in the lead up to this, Christopher Steele became a confidential human source for the FBI for a brief period of time. And that was formally terminated, because Christopher Steele was talking to the media specifically, although he talked to he talked to the New York Times, the Washington Post. I mean, he made multiple trips out to New York, but specifically he was talking to David Corn, and he gave up the existence of the dossier, et cetera. And David Corn published that in October. I think it was October 15th or 30th. But anyway, he was terminated as a source formally, but only because the FBI was sort of forced. Things were outed, and they felt they had to terminate him. So what did they do? McCabe himself specifically brought in Bruce Orr to maintain contact with Christopher Steele, and then those conversations would be relayed back into the FBI. And this process became almost codified, formalized, in that they actually had an FBI agent assigned to Bruce Orr, who was writing down and transcribing all of these interviews. And so for a period of November all the way going into May, the communications were essentially one way. Christopher Steele would call up Bruce Orr and kind of tell him what, new stuff he'd sort of fabricated, I guess, basically. And then Orr would transmit that back into the FBI. This new request was distinctly different. the FBI tasked Bruce Orr with going to Christopher Steele and saying, would you be willing to talk to the FBI? Up until that point in time, Bruce Orr had been the conduit between the FBI. Christopher Steele was not talking directly to the FBI. He was talking to Bruce Orr. Suddenly, after the firing of Comey and the preparation to open this new direct investigation into President Trump, the FBI, i.e. Andrew McCabe, wanted to talk directly to Chris Steele for exactly the purposes that you just laid out. So this request was entirely different. And it's always been very interesting that the FBI, we were able to find these 302s, and Congress was able to find these 302s of Bruce Orr's conversations with Chris Steele from November 21st up until May 15th. None were made after. Yet Bruce Orr testified that he had actually been talking to Christopher Steele in multiple periods after that. But the FBI mysteriously didn't have those 302s. So again, things changed materially, and it was done by McCabe.
Yeah, and now, having laid out all these facts about this guy, I mean, as corrupt as they come, they talk about third world countries and so on. This guy is worse than whatever you find in the worst places. This guy truly is one of the worst people you could have ever had in government in any place, and let alone in a position like this. And yet, what happened? What happened? Where are we? He's on CNN.
CNN.
He's the CNN national security, whatever, reporter or advisor or whatever the sort of fake title they gave him. They gave him a landing pad. Okay, you got fired from the FBI. Well, you get to earn even more money by just appearing on CNN and spreading more of your self-serving lies. And that's how broken the system is. A guy like this, and by the way, the inspector general, who isn't a Trump fan by any stretch of the imagination, said this guy needs to be indicted. And then the DOJ backed off because, because this was about lying to investigators. So McCabe had lied to investigators about leaking to the media, which, to be honest, is a tiny offense in the greater scheme of offenses that this guy has perpetrated. And yet, here he is. DOJ never did anything about it. And, you might say, oh, well, a Washington, D.C. jury would always acquit him because, that's how it works. And that's probably true. But there are other ways of doing it. I mean, you just bring the case somewhere else. I mean, McCabe's actions had nationwide impact. I mean, internationally, it had worldwide impact. But, you just pick out a jury in West Virginia or in Oklahoma or whatever. Just find a way to make that work. But no one was thinking outside the box because they didn't want to. I mean, everyone just wanted to let this guy get off. And that's how unfortunately it works. And he's kind of the perfect example of how completely, totally corrupt the entire thing is. And, I'm glad we should have probably talked about him earlier. I'm glad we're doing it now, also before Trump comes in, because perhaps there is an opportunity to come after him, despite all this being quite a long time ago.
Yeah, McCabe is one where I think you could make a case that he could be gone after, and I think he knows that. He's been acting very nervous. He's always been kind of this defender. He's the victim, always plays the victim card, defending the FBI. I also think that what Horowitz did is kind of an encapsulation of the way they handle it, that maybe McCabe got so out of bounds that their hand was forced, but then what does what does Horowitz focus on? He focuses on McCabe lying about leaks, which, as you said, is a relatively minor thing in the scheme of things. And even there, McCabe is so blatantly guilty. McCabe was fired for lying to the FBI's Office of Professional Responsibility, separately to agents from the FBI's Inspection Division and to the DOJ's Inspector General Michael Horowitz, and he lied under oath at least 3, if not 4 different times. Under oath, not just lied 3 or 4 times. He lied more than that, but he wasn't under oath at every instance. So this idea that he's a victim is totally out the window. But again, it's notable that Horowitz picked that small aspect to kind of condemn him over, as opposed to the much worse activities that McCabe was engaged in. This idea of kind of a limited hangout. Well, we'll focus on the small crime over there, and kind of get him out of the FBI or whatever and out of the public's eye, but we're not going to investigate the real problems that he was engaged in.
That's always how it works, isn't it? We said this before, but I'll say it again. January 20th cannot come soon enough. And I really hope that these things are not kind of brushed under the rug and, let's move on, because there are so many other problems. There are so many other problems, debt and immigration, and it's a huge list. But Russiagate, and especially the fact that the damage it caused to Trump's first term, the damage it caused worldwide. You think Ukraine war, just the bifurcation of the world order. I mean, it's a massive scam with huge implications, which will be around for the rest of at least our lifetimes, and it cannot be. And again, I remind everyone of what we read out at the start of this show, where this is what they said about Trump, that he was a Russian agent. That's what they put in that document. That cannot just be left and everyone moves on. You just can't do that. There have to be consequences for that.
A small group of people acting on the behest of kind of the establishment / deep state, whatever name you want to apply to it, literally attempted to overthrow a sitting U.S. president under false, fabricated pretenses. And, this is something that you and I have said for a long time, that cannot just be overlooked. That wasn't a little speed bump. And as you rightly said, I mean, that led to the alteration of our entire foreign policy, most specifically with Russia, but it also directly impacted China. And it led to the Ukraine war and to hundreds of thousands of deaths. This wasn't some sort of victimless crime. Literally attempted to overturn our Constitution, when you view it in those terms. And it led to actual, real, enormous, real world consequences.